Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, the first in a series of studies that comes out of our Mobility Navigator study. This one on electrification. Is the excitement draining? This is a ongoing series that we've done for several years, and so for those of us who've joined us in the past, welcome back. For those of you who are new, we hope that you'll find this information interesting. Graham, jump to the next slide. So with me today are a couple of my colleagues. So I'm Mike Van Newkirk. I'm the Automotive Client Officer for Ipsos. With me is John Kaiser, who's the Executive Vice President of U.S. Automotive and Mobility Development, or what we call AMD. And then Graham Gordon, also from the same group. He's a director within that team. Graham and John are the leaders and the authors of this particular study, and will be doing most of the sharing. So quickly, let me share with you the agenda for today. I'm going to give it first to John. John's going to cover an industry at a glance, kind of talk about what's been going on in the EV space in particular. And then he'll move into a discussion around where familiarity and consideration is today, with a bit of a look back on past years for a comparison. At that point, the conversation will go to Graham. Graham's going to talk about some of the top concerns that are still in the industry, some that are even a little newer, or let's say a little stronger today than they were in the past. And then a little bit different, we're going to have a sort of a conversation on sustainability. At that point, we'll kind of wrap it up with recommendations, and then we're going to do something a little different, something we haven't done before. We're going to have a little bit of a roundtable between the three of us to talk about some of our perspectives and thoughts coming from sort of three very different views on electrification in particular. So with that, we'll get started into the main part of the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to John. John, all yours.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Let's just dive into the status of things. We really like to give context of what's happening right now in the U.S. market, and specifically what we're looking at is EV market share is improving. With some strong year-over-year growth, which is encouraging. Right now, the market is about 6% of total sales in 2022 is for battery electric, and that's up 65% year-over-year. The prediction or expectation for 2023 is to reach about 1 million EV sales, which is certainly could be a break point or a threshold that will substantiate the size of this market. What we have seen is Tesla's has carried the overall market share in the space for roughly about 65%, and there are certainly more competitors in play in the market, and that's signified by the strength of the number of choices that are there. Ultimately, there is an extreme variety on the market today, with all major segments being represented, and hence that's why we're seeing the sales grow with small SUVs, mid-size SUVs, and even a full-size pickup EV out there. But what we are seeing is there's more BEVs coming. We're seeing is ultimately over 60 new BEVs are coming, all in major segments, large segments were the most popular segments, inclusive of large SUVs and large pickups. Certainly is exciting to see what's happening in the market. There is ultimately been a lot of announcements, and 2023 CES, New York Auto Show, a lot of new things coming, and that has been the focus of the industry. One thing we haven't shown here illustrated is there's actually even more electrified options, inclusive of PHEVs and hybrids out there. So we would see that electrification is certainly broadening and increasing in I guess you could say importance in the market overall. And certainly that's something to be mindful of, that electrification is real. If we go on to the next slide, we have seen some things happening in the market, and that is that EV prices on average is lower in 2022 and then versus 2021. That's a nice trend to see. It has been escalating. That could be much to do with the IRA. Ultimately, is that getting some, what amounts as OEMs or manufacturers are lowering their price to get and to qualify for some of those incentive money. But needless to say, these EVs that are coming out with it flooding the market, they have to compete with the current ICE vehicles as well as other competitive EVs. And what we've seen is ultimately adjustments in price happening. Just ultimately, in the past week, we've seen multiple price reductions from Tesla, which is unprecedented for them to be making these types of adjustments in the market. And then we've seen competition follow suit and make some adjustments. So specifically, we've seen this one clip from Ford doing that. But ultimately, what we're seeing is still that the average price of an EV is typically higher than an ICE vehicle. And right now, it's about a 10K gap. It is, but at a minimum, we would say it's encouraging that that price is coming down to help reduce that gap going forward. If you go on to the next slide, ultimately we're seeing is with the IRA specifically, or the Inflation Reduction Act, while the ultimate goal of this is to make EVs more accessible in the market, which is obviously encouraging to see, is basically trying to broaden that appeal, broaden the ability to get more consumers willing and able to buy it. This, through the renewal and the expansion of tax credits is how they've strived to do it. And that's where we have seen what ultimately some OEMs adjusting their price to be, get more comfortable levels, to make the price lower in order to qualify. But there has been also an additional element to this initiative, and that is to cause the secondary market, the used market, to provide access to some rebate as well, so that if you're buying it used, you also get a tax credit. And this assuming you meet some certain eligibility and income requirements, but nevertheless, it's a good addition to help expand and grow the market for more people. So definitely is an encouraging thing that they've incorporated. So if we go on to the next slide. Another thing that's happening in the market is this idea of climate change. We've seen it in the news. It's a key trend that we here at Ipsos have been monitoring across many global markets, and just to help us understand what's happening. It's one of these key things that we've been tracking. It is just omnipresent. We've something that we're monitoring across categories, but ultimately we want to understand its impact and how consumers would potentially act on it. How big of a deal is it, and what would they do about it? We have done a lot of research in this space. We have actually created even a segmentation that spans these categories. It's across the world and in the US to help us understand the idea of the climate change and sustainability. All in all, we've seen about 2/3 of the global population say they've experienced the effects of climate change, with 8 out of 10 saying that they believe we're headed in a direction of a disaster unless something does happen. So definitely we've seen a lot of differences in the level of concern related to this and sustainability, but the actual activity is what's at question. Are consumers really going to do something about it? Considering with EVs, it's in that sustainability space. It's just a matter of, what will they do? How will they act on it? We'll touch on some of that with some of our results later today. So if you go on to the next slide. We also referenced this idea of EV prices declining year over year, but we would say all in all, total vehicle prices have actually grown every month since 2021. The average cost of the vehicle has increased. Of course, this is creating an issue for the average consumer, not being able to afford to get a new vehicle, which is problematic. This has to do with, of course, still some shortage of supply at the dealers because we're still haven't fully recovered with the chip shortages. Inventory does remain inconsistent, low in some places. All in all, before the pre-pandemic, about 11% of transaction prices was incentives were utilized. The beginning of 2023, that was only about 3%. So it's coming back a bit, but it's not all the way back. So even in February, about 1/3 of consumers still paid more than the sticker price. That's not good for the industry, and that's not good for a long-term relationship with that local dealer, especially if the consumer feels like they've been taken advantage of. So that's not certainly a good thing, but that's what's happening still in the market today. Go on to the next slide. This idea of the cost of ownership, particularly in 2022. The cost of ownership showed the biggest gap between an ICE vehicle and an EV, and certainly increased the potential demand for an EV because it was actually cheaper to operate a battery electric vehicle in 2022. That had to do with the huge record gas prices that we've experienced, and I know that's subsided a bit, but we have some other issues that have happened with the economic risk, the uncertainty with inflation. It's caused interest rates to go up. So therefore, the cost to buy a vehicle has gone up because if you're financing it, you're not able to afford as much of a vehicle as a result, which is also problematic. But nevertheless, ultimately, it's a matter of being aware of what's happening here. And what we would say, and education is key, and knowing ultimately that it is cheaper to operate a BEV, but not necessarily consumers understand that, know that, what it truly is going to be for their situation. So education is certainly key as it relates to the cost of operating that vehicle. Go on to the next slide. Is it back a bit about the IRA and the potential missed opportunity here? Basically, what we see is the main goal of this has been to make EVs more accessible. But did it really work? Did it cause confusion? We're seeing that there is some confusion in the market. The rules are complicated. They're changing seemingly at will. Which vehicles actually qualify? Do they not qualify? It feels like it's changing. And certainly it's causing this confusion to consumers. Like maybe they just need to wait till things get settled before they make that purchase. That certainly is not, I'm sure the goal of the initiative was to spurn demand, to cause the shift over, but it's actually, like I would say, is a missed opportunity. We have seen, like I say, continued updates almost daily, if you will, which vehicles qualify, and that's not a good place to be. And I'm having a problem trying to figure it out and keep track of it. I couldn't imagine of a typical consumer, considering I'm in the industry. And then also we've seen with the recent announcements of the EPA, new restrictions being announced, and what pressure that's going to put on auto manufacturers to meet those requirements. Ultimately, it seems like this is going to just, like you say, cause more confusion, more uncertainty in the market on, which are these vehicles going to qualify? Are they not going to qualify? What's going to transpire for them in the market? So nevertheless, it's something to be mindful of, and it's something we'll keep track of as well as we monitor this. Go on to the next page. Ultimately, is another thing to talk about is infrastructure, the charging infrastructure. There are roughly about 61,000 public EV chargers out there, with 20,000 being built in 2022. That's great progress, but we would say, is that enough? Ultimately, the goal by 2030 here in the US is to have 500,000 charging ports, which is an ambitious goal, and we would say is needed, but they would say is, while the installation appears to be happening, but who's maintaining them? Who's ensuring that they actually work? Because we're finding as the experience of finding a workable public charger, it can be a significant challenge. It's not necessarily the customer experience that the industry desires. We have explored this in more detail, and I will say I'm personally have experienced this as being a new BEV owner in the state of California. I've had some struggles myself, which I wouldn't have expected. And we have done, and if you go on to the next page, is we did do a dedicated point of view that we published earlier this year called The Dark Side of EVs, which digs into this issue specifically. There are some significant challenges with public charging, and while we can infer this is perhaps the responsibility of the charging networks to maintain them, keep them operational, but ultimately, as a BEV owner and has a bad experience trying to get a charge, that has a significant impact on their willingness to perhaps recommend a BEV, recommend the brand. And that's not good, especially as you're trying to expand and grow the market. And so it really is a matter of understanding what is that hassle factor, how to address it so that you get over that hump, because you want that advocate, that BEV owner, to be promoting it, recommending it to friends and family, and that's certainly is a problem with this issue. If you go on to the next page, another key point is the inconsistency of the home charging experience. And essentially, it's all dependent on what's available to you, meaning where, what you can do. Because we would say a level one charger is more or less not going to be effective, more or less useless. You're not going to get much of a range add with an overnight charge experience. So you need a level two charger, but you need access. You need to be able to park your vehicle. You need to have access to 240 volt outlet in the same location, of course, in order to be able to do it. And if you don't have that 240 there, it's quite expensive to get a dedicated 240 line to that, garage or let's just say, parking space, your driveway, or some type of a carport. I mean, we are seeing level two chargers being installed in residential parking garages, like at apartments or condos, but there's no guarantee we'd have access to it when you need it. There may only be a few there that are installed, and you may not have the opportunity to get a charge when you're expecting to, and that's a problem. So ultimately, I would say for myself, I'm fortunate that I was able to get my level two home charger. It has been a game changer for me. I have a 300-mile plus range BEV. I don't do daily charging, but I'm able to get access to it and use it when I need it. And that certainly has been helpful, and I've gotten over that hump. Now, another point to raise is the idea of this point of view on the quality and the service challenges. This is something that surprised us on the surface. You would expect that EVs would be more reliable than an ICE because there's just more or less moving parts, right? Less things to go wrong. Fortunately, what we've seen with our quality tracking conducted globally across a variety of manufacturers showing that they're not problem free. There's a problem with that, right? Is to say, if the consumers are coming into the market and they're non-early adopters, right? That next hump of people who would be adopting, they're going to be less forgiving of some of the potential issues, and that's a problem. You want the market to grow fast, and it's needed to grow fast in order to meet some of these goals. So there's got to be need to address some of the quality issues that are being experienced, so that they can mitigate some of these issues and prevent some of the momentum in the growth. And that's certainly something we do. So there's a lot of information we have. I encourage you to go look at that point of view because it's packed with some great information. So certainly take a look at it. But today, with that context, we are going to get into some of our results from the Ipsos Navigator. It is a broader program. It is on electrification, driving technology, as well as mobility. But we're going to focus today on our EV trends and what's happening. We're going to focus on the U.S. results to give you some high-level assessment of what we're finding. But there's a lot more richness that could be shared, right? And as a subscriber, you get access to this data. Ultimately, what we have here is showcasing this global representation. It is amongst new vehicle buyers, meaning that they bought the vehicle new, but they've owned it for a period of time. So it's not like they just bought in the last year. But what we have done, it gives us a broad view, gives us an ability to understand what's happening in each of these countries. We do ensure that each country is representative of age and gender for that country. And all in all, we have about a 5% BEV ownership level across of our results. So looking at this is certainly going to give you a good representative idea of what's happening in each of the markets. And then specifically as we dive into the US, we'll certainly pull from that perspective to be able to understand what is transpiring. So with that, let's dive in. And specifically a familiarity and then go into consideration. First off, on familiarity, we are seeing that BEV familiarity is growing year over year, and that certainly is encouraging to see that it is growing, and particularly what we're seeing is that depth of knowledge is growing. It's not just that they heard about it, but they're more knowledgeable about, they're educated about it. And that's in part what we'd say is thanks to the coverage in the market. We've talked about all that context, with the IRA, you talk about the infrastructure build, you talk about all of the new models being launched. There's a lot of coverage, and therefore there's a lot more education awareness happening. But we would say, of course, there's more to be done. But ultimately, when we go to onto the next slide is what are we seeing with consideration? And this is actually new insights is that over the last few years, we've seen incredible growth in consideration levels. This year, not so much. I mean, we're seeing it stagnate. We're actually seeing it leveling off of the BEV consideration, and we would say that's problematic on what's happening in the industry. We want that to continue to grow and to be get that momentum, but we want to understand why is this happening? What is driving this result? If we go on to the next slide, on the surface, and that what we're seeing initially is that, of course, we would say younger buyers absolutely are more interested than older buyers, and that's been the case for a while. But what we're seeing is the most decline is of the younger buyers year over year. And they are the future in every sense. And it's basically making sure to still grab hold of their enthusiasm and their excitement and try to understand what is causing their lack of consideration. Why is it faltering, and in more detail, and across all of the generations of, of course, if the younger, the Gen Y and the Gen Z, as well as Gen X and the boomers, to understand that. And that's where I'll hand this over to Graham and could go into more of the details of what's transpiring with this year's results. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And I think you've hit on the $1 million question, right? If consideration was going up over the past couple of years and starting to really gain traction, what's happened to make this kind of wane? And we talked about the external factors, but what about what's going on with the respondents internally and how they actually are, thinking and feeling? What's limiting that growth in their own mind? And what we wanted to do was we wanted to first look at the top concerns that these respondents had. Now, this is just one question on our survey, and we're going to dig a bit deeper into the meaning behind everything. But I think this is a really good starting point, because what we see is that there's three main groups that are limiting consideration because of their concern. Number one, it's battery life and driving range, not yet really meeting the standards of the established ICE counterparts. Number two is going to be that their charging behavior doesn't necessarily meet their current expectations and how they anticipated working with their vehicle. And then lastly, we're looking at both initial and ongoing costs, which both are acting as a barrier that's kind of stopping those considerers from confidently pulling the trigger and actually becoming a BEV owner and a BEV adopter. So to start off, let's talk range and battery life, because I think this is still the top concern every year, and it's old news, but it's important news, because this is, I think, apart from price, the one number that you see in every article and sticker about BEVs is what is their range, what can they do? And for this year, that was definitely still the case. These have been the biggest barriers for electric vehicles. Battery life is the number one concern. Driving range is the number three concern. And they're both up 5% year over year. The one alarming thing is that for the younger consumers that really took a hit to consideration this year, this issue is amplified. They had a 10% increase year over year on battery life and a 12% increase on driving range compared to our study in 2022. So this is definitely top of mind for consumers, and it's definitely going to continue to attract the most eyes when the pre-purchase process is in full effect. Now, it's not affecting everyone identically. If you look at those in a major metro area, it's about 3 out of 10 list this as a top issue, versus suburban and rural respondents, it's a majority. It's 53 and 59%. And to me, it's basic math, but it's really significant math, right? In places where everything is within reach, range isn't as much of an issue. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have their own issues going on. But it's an important thing to note that it's hurting some more than others, not just in age, but where they live and how they use their vehicle. And on top of that, talking about that number that people seem to seek out, the minimum acceptable range is a question that we ask. And overall, consumers are requiring around 296 miles of range in order to really start considering their vehicle to be a BEV. That's up from 291 in 2022. For BEV considerers, It's a bit better. It's at 250 miles of range that they would accept at a minimum. Whereas for non-considerers, it's pretty alarming. That's 360 miles of range, and what that tells me, that gap is pretty large. It's over 100 miles in range. So for non-considerers, they're basically looking for a vehicle that can match their current behavior of an ICE vehicle, and that's a lot more difficult to convert those people into considerers or into owners versus the considerers that realize that there's a check and balance between range and fill-ups at the gas station. Now, the good news with this number is that we have a source from Bloomberg that says that the average range of the vehicles currently in the market is around 290, meaning that we're theoretically at a breaking point for many, at least in the range department. In reality, that's not always the case because, again, we're talking about minimum acceptable range, and we're talking about perfect conditions that are stated on the sticker of the car. So in reality, those figures need to be exceeded pretty strongly in order to convert those considerers into buyers, because you've got imperfect conditions and you've got imperfect situations that you want to be in. Now, this being the top issue, once it becomes a bit more solved, there's still other areas that everyone needs to worry about, and that's charging behavior. This is a concern that's been getting a lot of traction, and that's why John was writing about it in his point of view. And in my mind, it's also unique in the fact that price, like I said, price and range are these two numbers that you hear of often when shopping for your vehicle, but people aren't necessarily quantifying anything about charging behavior or really giving you the upfront news about it. So for now, we're looking at recharging time and few public charging stations. These are the second and fifth ranked concerns on our list. And I think it's really important that this gets traction because it's not up as much year over year, 3% and 2%, as some of the other metrics that we're going to be looking at today. But we see it's definitely an issue in terms of the ranking. I mean, recharging time is actually above range in terms of concerns. And there's even within the top 10 figuring out how to charge at home. In addition, the unique thing about these charging stations is for stuff like range or cost, there's usually one or two players in the auto manufacturers or maybe the battery manufacturers that play a part. Whereas charging stations, there's a lot more going on. There's automakers, landowners, charging companies, utilities, governments from the local, state, and federal level. They're all handling this in different ways, and they all have to be communicating and agreeable to what the solution is, and we're just not there yet. So to start off with, we're looking at charging time, right? The acceptable fast charging time, this means that you're probably using a public charging station and charging it from 0% to 80%. The average acceptable time that respondents stated in our survey was around 23 minutes. For considerers, it's a bit higher at 26 minutes, whereas the non-considerers, again, are a bit more demanding. They want something around 20 minutes, and that's most likely because again, they want to equate it to what their timing at a fill-up station would be for their regular ICE and gasoline vehicle. All of these numbers are consistent year over year. So again, it's just a really good metric to gauge where exactly we are with this specific concept as it relates to BEVs. But it's not just charging times. It's also about the frequency and where people are charging, because even when you can figure out better the charging times or the battery life, what also needs to happen is you need to be able to educate your consumers about how often you're going to be charging and where you're going to be charging. We noticed that BEV owners are reporting that they charge daily or weekly at a higher rate compared to what those BEV considerers would expect to. And this is not just, out and about in public charging stations. This is even at home and at work. So I think it's really, really important to educate those consumers and make sure that it's on par with what the owners already expected, because this isn't necessarily just a barrier to that entry, but it's also causing apprehension towards the EVs in terms of the ownership post-purchase. When they're not ready for what's coming, they're not going to become an advocate, and you need those advocates to bring more considerers into the world of BEVs or convert those considerers into owners. Now, that's not to say that infrastructure isn't growing, because as John had pointed out, we do have more ports that are being installed every day, and we do notice, according to BEV owners, that this infrastructure is getting better. Whereas an 84% in 2022 said that they need more public charging stations in their area, BEV owners now say that at 73%. So it's getting better. And 83%, so over 4 out of 5 note that their current at-home and public charging station needs are getting met. So that's all good news, and they're at least content, if not complacent. But it's important to note that 73% of BEV owners saying that they need more public charging station is still an issue. Just because their needs are getting met doesn't necessarily mean that there's not room for improvement, and that doesn't necessarily mean that considerers or those that need to be converted will feel the same way. They're probably more demanding. That's why they haven't had that purchase to begin with. And doesn't mean that they're going to magically acquiesce to whatever the current landscape is. You have to do better. And even more so, the thing that I notice when it comes to conversion of these considerers is these non-owners, 62% mentioned that they are seeing more BEVs on the road compared to last year, but that number is only 52% for charging stations. And this isn't just in urban centers or rural centers. This is urban, suburban, and rural alike. And what I figure is consideration happens a lot with experiences, right? It's not news, it's not word of mouth. If you're seeing BEVs on the road, you become more attracted to the idea because there must be something to the tech if you've got people in the seats. The problem is when you see BEVs but you don't see charging stations and you don't have that tactile proof, those barriers are hard to overcome because all of a sudden it looks like a half-baked effort. So you have to have an almost one-to-one progression of both of those things in order to really sell this as a full scheme that is working not just for those that want it to be a fashion statement, but it really operates at a high level in terms of the charging station availability. So that's charging stations. The third concern I wanted to talk about is cost, both initial and ongoing. Because as John had mentioned, the EVs are currently higher priced than the average vehicle. So obviously it makes sense that it's a concern, but there are things going on behind the scenes. We look at these 3 metrics: the battery replacement costs, affordability, and the high overall cost of ownership. All 3 of those have increased year over year. Battery replacement costs and affordability especially. When it comes to affordability, boomers are the most concerned overall, probably because they're entrenched with their ICE vehicles, and they also have the lowest income. Even if they have disposable income, more of them are becoming retired, and it's harder for them to take that type of leap when it comes to that cost of ownership. And it should also be noted that for Gen Y and Gen Z, this was one of the bigger jumps in concern year over year, with an 11% increase compared to 22, which really shows the insecurities about their own economic behaviors and how they're handling their money, because absolute price is definitely a key issue for them. Now, the thing that's interesting about it is for years, these BEVs had been these flagship luxury vehicles. We're going to shove as much tech in it as possible, and that became the standard. So 71% of people believe that BEVs should be including all of the latest high-tech features that are available, but that is in direct opposition to the fact that 4 out of 5 also want a vehicle that is low in cost and cost of ownership. And that's a dichotomy that's just starting to adjust. We've now just started getting mass market players in here and working to figure out what gizmos and gadgets are absolutely necessary, which ones are nice to have, which ones aren't necessary. And this is something that Ipsos has been doing as well, to try and figure out not only what features are necessary, but at what price points, and how we can figure out that sweet spot for those both ICE and BEV vehicles. And in some cases, it might be a subscription. It might be, holding off until it's more proven. There's a lot of different things that go into that decision making. But on top of that, the one strange concept is the idea that the cost of ownership myths still persist. John had mentioned earlier that BEV cost of ownership, what it takes to operate the vehicle post-purchase, is actually lower for BEVs than ICE. But when we look at current sentiment regarding the BEV capabilities, only 35% believe that BEVs actually have lower cost of ownership, even though the data says so. And the really strange thing is for BEV considerers, that number is still 55%, which means that almost half of BEV considerers are expecting to just straight up bite the bullet on higher cost of ownership, not realizing that they're actually going to be saving money. Now, the non-considerers for BEVs are hard to convince at 13%. These are people that are probably entrenched with their own opinions. They're probably not necessarily expecting or assuming what the cost of ownership woes are going to be. But for those BEV considerers, the challenge for this industry is going to have to be to educate and to make sure that you know exactly what the cost of ownership of your vehicle is, because that gap needs to be close to 100%, that they know that cost of ownership is lower for BEVs. And this is true for younger consumers. Younger consumers are more likely to understand this, but it's still an issue. So we've talked a lot about what concerns people, and we've really just scratched the surface. There's a lot more support, not only for these concerns, but also just talking about, current perceptions about BEV vehicles and the current industry at large. The one thing that I do want to touch on is sustainability, because while it's not necessarily a concern that is top of mind within our study, it is something that's worth mentioning because it still does play a role, and it does play a role in consideration. Now, in theory, this is a pretty solved subject. 69% say climate change is a serious threat. 62% know about reducing emissions and it being important to them. This isn't just something that Gen Y and Gen Z hold. This is a majority opinion even among boomers. So this is pretty solved in theory. The reality, though, is it's a lot more complicated, because what ends up happening is they're not acting on it. 42% are willing to give up convenience for these environmentally friendly products, and 40% want to buy the vehicles that actually reflect their commitment to their environment that they hold dear in that last slide. So even though everyone's agreeing that something has to be done, not everyone's acting about it. And when you're an older consumer, that's even doubly so. They're really not acting on it, and they're kind of entrenched in their ways. So what does that necessarily mean? Well, when we're talking about that segmentation that John was pointing at earlier, these BEV owners might be activists, right? They're concerned and they're acting on it and they're trying to make a difference in their own personal way. But for the BEV considerers, they might be pragmatists, but really they're more conflicted contributors. They have a decent level of concern. They're knowledgeable, they're educated about it. But in terms of how engaged they are with sustainability, it's not really a driving force in their decision making. Price point is probably more so what they're looking for and what drives their actual purchasing behavior over this level of concern that they have for the environment. And we did do something interesting. We took it to another level and looked at all the different attributes that could go into consideration. We have a list of about 15 different attributes, and as well as we graded 20 different brands on their current performance in this. So when you look at how each of them is performing, we have not just their opinions on BEVs and how their range or their dedication to building BEVs is. We're also looking at their ICE vehicles, how their styling is, how their ADAS technologies are. And then lastly, we even talked about sustainability. How important is that to their consideration? And we found some pretty interesting insights. Now, again, we looked at 20 plus brands. I put 4 here just to give you a taste of what we're trying to do here, because we had 3 main drivers of consideration. It's the value for the money, the range, and the use of sustainable materials. So sustainability is something that is driving consideration. And you can see that even among these 4 brands, there's a wildly different execution, not just in what they're trying to show, but also how they're comparing to other brands. If you're someone like Tesla or Audi, which has a higher price point, yes, you don't necessarily have good value for the money. But in Tesla's case, you're winning in a lot of other very important areas. Audi is still industry average, but they're climbing the ranks. They're still doing pretty well. Whereas when you look at someone like Chevrolet and Hyundai, right, those mass market vehicles that are coming in, like the Ioniq 6 or the Blazer EV or the Silverado EV, they might be giving you better value for your money versus the industry average, but they still have some work to do. Hyundai is, much like Audi, doing a pretty good job on some of those other stronger levels of consideration. For Chevrolet, it's a bit of an uphill battle. But again, these are all current perceptions of the brands. We've got new vehicles coming out. This battle is just starting, and we've got a lot more assessment that we can do based on these brands. So I implore you to reach out to us, because we've got a lot of great data on this, showing you not only what you're doing well in and what you're doing poorly in, but also what brands are, pushing that consideration because they're focusing on the right things, or maybe they're doing really well on something but focusing on the wrong things. These are all things that these brands need to know in order to excel into this new world once consideration is back in a space where we need it to be. And when we're talking about consideration, in terms of the top considered brand among considerers, I think it's been pretty clear over the past couple of years that Tesla reigns supreme. Toyota and Audi cracking to the top three also isn't necessarily surprising. But you're seeing a lot more mass market brands breaking into this top 10. BMW year over year has actually slid down to that fifth spot, whereas Nissan, Hyundai, and Acura are newer into this top 10, beating out even non-automotive brands like Apple. And the other thing I think I would note about this is that consideration for all brands year over year is slightly down. So Tesla was above 30%, Toyota was above 25% last year. And that coincides with that dip in consideration that we're seeing year over year. And lastly, in terms of the top models that people are considering, these are the new and upcoming BEVs. So this isn't going to include, the Tesla Model 3 or even the F-150 electric that came out this past year. We're talking about the upcoming BEVs and what people are excited about. Obviously, the Tesla Roadster is top for the sedan and coupe. This has kind of been the boogeyman for BEVs for a long time. But we also have some interesting ones in terms of the BMW i7 and the Hyundai Ioniq 6 for the sedan and coupe BEV considerers. The Ford Explorer EV for the SUV and vans is interesting because I don't even think it's coming to the US. I know they're bringing it into other markets as a rebadged, I believe, Volkswagen, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's coming to the US, but it is still top because that name brand is so, it has permeated into our culture, as well as the Ioniq 7 and the Lexus RZ. Those also cracked into the top three among SUV and van considerers. And then lastly, and you'll see these numbers are higher because these pickup truck considerers are so high on these specific vehicles, and there's fewer of them. But the Toyota Tacoma EV, the Silverado EV, and the Sierra EV are all highly anticipated vehicles. So again, I threw a lot at you, and yet somehow this has only scratched the surface of what we've given you. I want to send it over to John to kind of tell you what's next, what we can do, what's going to push us forward. But I also implore you to reach out to us. Let us know what we can do, not only for your brand, but additional insights that interest you. But John, if you want to take it away, we can wrap this up.
Yeah, go ahead and go on to the next page. And so, yeah, definitely wrap up. And just as a, what we are seeing is, go on to the next slide, Graham, is, regardless of the age group, we do see the top three attributes float to the top of what's going to improve adoption. That's range, price, cost, and then charging. And we've talked about that a lot today. Those certainly we're seeing is key. But it's also, we would say, is, how do we influence this? How do we impact it? And it's across the different stakeholders who can help improve this, from the automakers to the charging companies, governments, even landowners, landlords, owning of apartment buildings and things like this can certainly help influence and create the more accessibility for some of these things. But one thing we have seen that we would say year over year has grown is this idea of bigger incentives. So that has been the biggest increase we've seen so far. But all in all, we would say education is especially key. Just having the added info to help mitigate some of the confusion that's around the incentives, charging infrastructure issues, and how to address those is being informed is certainly going to get people over the hump into BEV adoption. So if you go on to the next slide. all in all, our core recap is that EV consideration is faltering at a time when it just can't lose momentum. And specifically, and we go into point one, the new EV launches, the price cuts. And climate change worries of should be incentivizing considerers, but it's faltering right now, right? We would expect more momentum. And if going to the second point, it's about the idea of the economic woes, of the confusion about the IRA restrictions or what it's going to take in order to qualify is problematic. So it's certainly a little bit self-inflicted, we would say, but it's definitely something to be addressed. Third point is about the youth are the most likely age cohort to consider the BEVs. They are losing the interest. That is a blow to the future of EVs. They are that literal future. So addressing their needs will be key, and how to cultivate and regrow that is certainly going to be a key focus area for the industry. Point four, consistent year over year. It's about range and cost, right? And to address that, it's still a gap to monitor, and it's about that education, but something to still stay focused on. On point five, it's, we're talking about all of the stakeholders is key. I just touched on that, but it is key as charging stations and addressing that and helping support that to help with that overall improvement. So while they're getting built, they need to be maintained and ensure and improving that experience so that it can be, seamlessly utilized, and there's not a worry on whether you can get a charge and where you can get a charge and is it going to work and all those kinds of things. So definitely needs to address that growing issue in the industry. And on the last point is about sustainability is ultimately people do care about it. It is something that needs to be addressed, but it is about the priorities overall, and that substantively sustainability does matter to help drive that BEV adoption, but it's a matter of it's not all of the considerations. It's not a driving force, but it is a driving force all in all for the space, and it's a matter of addressing that smartly. So if you go on to the next slide, really, like I said, we've touched that we are just scratching the surface on the insights that we had shared here with the U.S. focus. We have a global view. We have more cuts, all these different things you can get access to as a subscriber. We've touched on it just for the EV trends. There are subsequent modules to address. That's coming up next is on driver technology is the second module that will be coming, and then we have our mobility that would be happening towards the end of the year. But a lot of good stuff, richness. Certainly reach out to us, and we can certainly help you and give you access to it and figure out what that works best for your company. If you go on to the next slide, we also have some additional handouts as part of our link here and I've referenced it as our point of view of the dark side of EVs. We also have a couple other things to help navigate what's happening in the market. We have a couple of solutions. That's the over-the-air update, quality audit to help you identify any issues as OTAs get rolled out. This is a growing need in the market especially with some of the tech that being able to monitor, is it being successfully implemented or not, and helping identify how to improve that. Another is doing an actual EV charging station audit. We have a solution. We have a team that could be able to go out and do this for you, whether it's in a specific market or certain brands you want to look at. There's obviously certain ability for us to do this. This information is there as part of the handouts. Encourage you to take a look at it and follow up with us if you have any questions on that. So with that does really wrap up the content we wanted to share overall, but we do have a couple of posing questions, almost like a little mini roundtable. And so I'll hand it back over to Mike to help moderate that for us. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Mike. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And thanks, Graham. Great stuff, guys. So we're right near the end. We thought we'd do something a little different. We haven't tried this in the past, but we found that we are situated with three very unique perspectives on EVs in particular. So I represent the boomer side of the generations. Yes, I am a boomer. Hard to believe, I know. Thank you, but it is true. And then we also have John, who represents Gen X, and Graham, who is Gen Y. And incidentally, John, he mentioned earlier, is a BEV owner. Graham is one who acknowledges that he is considering a BEV. And then I'm the ICE driver, the person who is less likely to move into BEV. So thought we'd kind of do a little roundtable. I have some notes that I had from some questions that I created, and I'm going to kind of share these with the guys. I'll also answer myself if my perspective differs from theirs in some way. So with that, we're going to start off by, I'm going to start with Graham. So Graham, you've said you're somebody who is considering potentially getting a BEV, right? And you went into a lot of detail in your talk about concerns. So what are your top concerns about BEVs?
I think it used to be ranging costs, because I do think that they were so upfront and in your face, and trying to monitor where those things were going to be before I could start really considering a BEV. But recently, and maybe it's been just plagued by really researching and looking at all this, that the charging stations are probably my top concern now, because it's a bit more obscured until you've already purchased the car, and it's a bit more behind the scenes and not knowing what you're going to get. So for me, that's been, I guess, my biggest concern and the biggest barrier that I'm going to have to overcome.
Good. Interesting. So John, you recently bought a BEV. So keeping sort of in that vein of concerns, what actually got you over the hump?
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, it was, I'm very practical, I'm somewhat rational, but it was about the knowledge of the cost of ownership that helped me get over the hump. And that because of my behaviors, I do a lot of in-city driving. I did like 20K miles last year, and I live in California. I was paying over $6 a gallon in gas. So it was a practicality reason. I did almost have a little bit of a, worry, buyer remorse, like because of the public charging, like I was having some problems, but then I was actually freed once I got past that education hump. Doing it at home, I felt a lot better about it and being able to do that. But it's such a unique experience for me in that. But nevertheless, it was that was my main reason that got me over the hump. But then it like my experience, and I seem to have jaded Graham there. So I apologize for that, Graham. My apologies.
No sweat.
Very good. Well, all right. So I'm going to have to weigh in because I'm the guy who is more, sort of staying in the ICE space. So I'm the holdout, so to speak. But that doesn't mean I'm anti-BEV. I'm not, in fact. But it's more a matter of, is it really right for me right now? I just don't see the necessity of it, or at least not yet. And this really goes back to one of the very first things we talked about, which is the cost of a BEV versus a traditional ICE vehicle. Primarily, what it comes down for me is I don't drive like John is, 20,000 miles. I used to, but I don't anymore. And in my current role in the company and the kind of work I'm doing, I don't put nearly the same amount of miles on it. So the idea of trying to figure out the justification, recognizing that in the long run, it would probably be less expensive to operate in a BEV than an ICE. I just don't see where that path leads to at this point. So maybe that changes in time, but that's really what's kind of keeping me on the ICE side for now. All right. I'm going to kind of switch the topic a little bit because we talked a lot about charging networks and some of the issues. Graham, you even said that's kind of shifted to be your primary concern today. So with that in mind, knowing that it needs to get better in many ways, who do you think, in your opinion, who's really responsible for the charging infrastructure? And let's start with, let's say, John.
I've spoke about it a lot and had this experience, but yes, I would say the government certainly does have a role in helping with the incentivizing to get that installation done and equipped, but it's this idea of who's maintaining them, right? And I would think, of course, the charging networks, but I do think there's an opportunity where the utility can partner with that charging network because they're getting access to that electricity, right? I would think that would be beneficial and it help mitigate some of the issue because those utilities would be on the ground there and could help with that. Ultimately, even the auto manufacturers can help with the support with certain key partnerships as well, and helping maintain in certain regions because of where their presence is potentially. But nevertheless, I think it is a multi-prong solution. It's not a singular solution, I think, in order to help improve this.
Okay, thank you. Graham, what about you? What are your thoughts?
I'm just about the same. I think that governments definitely need to help incentivize that kind of cross-country network, because what happens if they don't is if the market's not there, you're not building charging stations cross-country, right? You're staying in urban centers. And then you kind of get this back and forth of, well, we're not going to build the charging stations because we don't have enough BEV owners in the area. Well, we don't have enough BEV owners in the area because there are no charging stations. And you can go back and forth forever, but no one's ever going to get anything done. So I think in order to have a cross-country network, you need to have some sort of government incentive. But like John said, ultimately, it's got to come down to the charging networks and the OEMs or the utilities to ensure that whatever they implement is implemented correctly with an eye towards the future and dependability and making sure that it can be used when called upon.
Great. I'll just weigh in with this. I agree with you both. I think what you've said is spot on, but I'm going to add a little caveat to that, and it kind of plays on something, Graham, you had said earlier in the presentation, and that is about what that charging experience is like. And right now, it's a unique experience that people have to learn and adapt to. And I think for many people, it's going to need to become a more normal experience. And what I mean by that is I think about what it's like to go to the gas station to fuel up. And it's not about the fueling itself, but it's about all the other stuff. It's about having a secured environment. It's about having coverage from the elements. It's about having these other amenities, a convenience store, things of that nature that we've come to expect. And so maybe it's a little bit of try to move it into my world, so to speak, where I'm wanting more of a quote unquote normal experience. So yes, absolutely agree. Governments, charging station companies, and as well moving that into a more normal experience, I think will appeal to those that are probably in a situation like me where maybe we're not quite considering because we're just not really ready to change completely. So, all right. One last question for the two of you, and then we'll wrap it up. So recently there was some new EPA requirements that were released. These are going to certainly make it a little more difficult for ICE variants to be able to meet those new restrictions. That puts a lot of pressure on that side of the industry. So I want you to talk a little bit about what do you think about this sort of pressure on ICE and how it relates to BEVs moving forward. So let's go with Graham.
Sure. I'll be honest, I'm hardly ever for a requirement that's going to hamper consumer choice. We've already seen things happen in the European Union that kind of have been following that track, but a couple years ahead of where the US is right now. But even then, OEMs like VW and I think Porsche even have been kind of pushing back on those restrictions and saying, it's too aggressive or it's too early. We need more time. You got to work with us a bit here. So I'm not necessarily for that yet. Instead, what I'd like to do is promote it so that promote BEVs so that they can happen quicker and more naturally without having to shut down the idea of the traditional ICE vehicle. Because what will happen is it's going to happen a bit more naturally as BEVs become, you've got more selection there, you've got more attractiveness in terms of the range and the price points. Really, you just need some patience for that, the OEMs to get to where they need to be, and then it'll do everything for you.
Great. John, what about your thoughts?
Well, I agree. I don't like necessarily taking choice away. I mean, I get this idea of the environment. We bring that back, right? That there's an environment is real. There has to be some guardrails. But we got to focus on the infrastructure. I think the product that's being built with BEVs is fantastic. We haven't spoken. It's not like we said that's bad. The problem is the access to be able to use it is what's bad, because we would be having the same conversation if we didn't have gas stations and we had a bunch of gas vehicles and you didn't have no access to gas. We'd be complaining about that. But we have access to gas because that's been built. We just have to, build the infrastructure. So it does take a little time to get there. So maybe it's mitigating that to get to that true inflection point. So it's growing together rather than have the restriction be too tight. And then we are in a predicament, if you will, as it relates to not being ready for it. But anyway, that's my views on it. Take it for what it is.
Great. No, those are good points, guys. And I tend to agree with you. I think obviously the EPA is going to put some pressure on manufacturers to be able to achieve that. But I'm definitely for you. If we can build up the infrastructure and we can create I've said it before, the more normal experience, have it become a norm overall, I think we're on the right path to BEVs than really staking their claim in the industry. So, all right. So, thank you, everyone, for your time today. You've got a lot of information, as the guys have said. There's tons and tons more. If you're a subscriber to the study, we thank you for that. We know you'll continue to see the value that this study's been bringing you. If it's new to you, reach out. We'd love to chat with you. We can show you more about what the studies offer and how that it can add value into your own business. So with that, I'm going to say thank you and have a great day.